Welcome to the Carey Nieuwhof Leadership Podcast on YouTube. In this episode, we hope to help you thrive in life and leadership. And I want to tell you about two things before we dive in. First of all, how is your team culture? You know, my friends at Leader have an assessment for you to really tell whether your employees are engaged or not. You can check it out at leader.com/culture. That's leadr.com/culture. Just click the link. And I've got something for you called the Preaching Cheat Sheet. I've been communicating, preaching, giving keynote talks for over 30 years. And there's a hard way to do it and an easy way to do it. And I can't do the hard work of coming up with great content, but I can show you how to do it better, faster, and far more efficiently so that you can really focus on what matters. I've got 10 steps inside the cheat sheet that will help you get to a great talk faster starting right now. You can just click on the link or go to preachingcheatsheet.com. That's preachingcheatsheet.com. And now to today's episode. Jordan, welcome to the podcast.
Carey, thank you so much for having me. Good to be with you.
Yeah, so I love talking to younger leaders. And one of the experiences you had early in life is starting out, becoming somewhat successful, and then having it all kind of crumble, which I know has happened to a lot of people. And then you built it back up. Can you walk us through what happened, like in that origin story? What took place, Jordan?
Yeah, and I'll provide a little bit of context and background as well, Carey. But I was 27 years old. I had a 5-year run post-college working at a major financial firm. So this is a Fortune 100 company. I was appointed as a leader inside that company. I was actually the youngest in my position inside the entire company. So wow. It was a bit of hard work meets opportunity. But what had happened to me in that 5-year run, Carey, is my work really became my life. And all of a sudden, my heart got really wound up and entangled in achievement and success, in recognition, in the praise of people. And without even really knowing it, it soon became my idol. I mean, it was the thing that I was really living for. I was working 12 to 14-hour days every day, didn't really take days off. And it just consumed me. So I'm running really hard. I'm moving really fast. And on April 1st, 2015, everything changed. I got a call from my supervisor, and he said, "I need to see you today." And I remember I was so naive. I thought, I don't have time for that. I got people to see. I'm gonna have to do this on a different day. And he said, "Well, it's one of those meetings where you clear your calendar." And I thought, oh boy, this is going to be a serious conversation. So several hours later, I walked into his office, and this is what he told me. He said, "You haven't been malicious or intentional, but you've been careless and casual. And when you're casual, you create casualties. And today is going to be the last day for you at our firm." So I'll tell you how this thing unfolds here in just a second. But again, for some additional context, I was flying to a new city every week to teach and train. My work inside that company had become quite extensive. I was scheduled to be our closing speaker at a major conference with 15,000 people. I was building a large house with a total lack of wisdom as a young single person. And I was involved in a bunch of real estate projects, all of which were about to go sideways as a result of my employment status. So I wasn't just about to lose my job. I was about to lose all of my money. I was about to lose most of all of my influence. My reputation was about to also be severely damaged. And in about a 15-minute conversation with my then supervisor, I find out it's my last day. But to paint a bit more of a picture, I was just one of those guys, Carey. I was underdeveloped and overexposed. I was out front, I was communicating, I was leading, I was teaching, I was training, but behind the scenes, my backstage life really wasn't developed. I knew my goals, but I really didn't know my values. And there's that old adage, if you are clear about your you're clear about your goals, but not your values, your goals can take you to a place you never intended to go. And so I just kind of woke up in this world that I didn't really understand. And my work had become my life. And I think God had said, enough, And so I'll tell you real quick, I had an assistant take a test on my behalf, and I didn't report it.
There you go.
That was the infraction. Yeah. And
so you were supposed to have done the test. What was it? A real estate test or
it was a continuing education test, just a financial services, kind of a 20 question multiple choice test. And in my pursuit, in my speed, she was trying to be helpful. And so she just decided to step in and take that test. And which can happen. That's an infraction. And when I found out about it, I didn't report it like I should have. And so
she did it without your knowledge, but once you knew, you didn't remediate. That's
right. Yeah, I just didn't do the right thing. And it was a lack of character, lack of integrity. Somebody could look at that and say, well, that's a small infraction and a large price to pay. And maybe that's true, but I think, the Bible tells us we have to be faithful with a little. And the truth is there was a lot in that season of my life, Carey, that I was not being faithful in. So many decisions that I was making to stay out late at night, I
was going to say, to the extent you're comfortable, like what? Because I think I want to get down on early success. I want to talk about that because I think there's a lot there.
Yeah. I mean, alcohol was an issue at that time in my life. I had no problem, going out 2-3 nights a week. Nothing major, wasn't like drugs were involved. It wasn't like I had serious relationship issues. It was just, I was living for the party. I was living for the high of success and money and achievement and status. And if you've seen the movie Wolf of Wall Street, it was probably a little bit like Wolf of Wall Street minus the drugs, minus the criminal activity. There was none of that. Yeah. But it was just that sort of aura of I want to win, and I want to win so bad that I'll do, kind of whatever it takes. And I think God said, I created you for more than that. I want to save you from this. And by God's grace, he saved me. And then the story ends in this really cool way that as I write this next chapter of my life, which I'm sure we'll get to. But yeah, that was a tough season.
What was under that drive? Like when you look back at it now, what drove you?
It was really simple. I think it was the praise of people. I think I wanted validation more than anything. I wanted somebody to say, wow, he's impressive. And I hate admitting that now, like that sounds so ugly, but it's true. That was the sin in my life. And, there's that adage that if you live for the praise of man, you'll die by the criticism of man. Yeah. And so what rocked me from the inside out was that I had been living for the praise. And so because all of a sudden I didn't have it, and it was the opposite. It was judgment. It was the rumor mill. It was the significant fall from grace. The criticism just crushed me. But that was the sin in my life. I really wanted the approval of people.
It's something I've been thinking about a lot. The phrase you used, underdeveloped and overexposed, and I think that's a real challenge. So this happened to you, 10 years ago or so, or
it was 27. This was almost 9 years ago. Yeah,
9 years ago. All right. So there was social media, but it wasn't quite what it is now, right?
That's right.
I get questions all the time from young leaders who are like, man, I want to build a platform, and how do you get a platform and all that stuff. But I think there's an inherent danger in being, as you say, overexposed. Let's say it really does blow up, but you're underdeveloped. How do you know, like if there's a lot of young leaders listening to the show, how would you know you're really close to that precipice, that moment when the whole thing starts to crumble?
I think it happens through discipleship and mentoring. In other words, I wasn't asking enough questions. I didn't have enough accountability. I wasn't being discipled. I wasn't being mentored. I look back and I go, wow, there should have been way tighter guardrails. Like I needed way tighter guardrails. I love what our friend Craig Rochelle says. He says, why would you resist a temptation tomorrow that you could resist today? And I know in Craig's life, just to pick on Craig a little bit in a positive way, Craig has some really, really tight guardrails. He was joking with me the other day. He said, I can't research hot air balloons, because it has the word hot. He said, there's people that look at my text messages and look at my emails, and somebody might look at that and go, wow, that's crazy. I would never want to live. That's crazy. And I think Craig might say this. He didn't say this, but I think Craig might say, listen, if you want to have crazy impact, you have to have some crazy guardrails. And I just didn't have guardrails. So if you're a young leader and you think you're bumping up, I would just suggest get some accountability, get a mentor, make sure you're being discipled, make sure you're in God's word. You got to have some people in your life that are willing to ask you the tough questions and they're giving you real and honest feedback.
Was some of it the chase though?
No question.
Yeah.
No question.
And how so?
I never had money growing up. I came from kind of a blue collar background. So I didn't really understand. I really had no context, no relationship with money. And so I think for me, when I came into it, it was like this brand new thing. And I didn't understand. So here's the irony of it all, Carey. And this is what's going to sound so ugly and rotten. I was a financial advisor who was making a bunch of money at a really young age, who had an awful relationship with money.
Oh, I don't think you're alone in that. Go on.
Yeah, it just consumed me, and that's what the scripture says. The love of money is the root of all evil. I let it consume me. I didn't have guardrails. The chase was, I wanted to build my kingdom.
Yeah.
That was really it.
And you're involved in some real estate deals. You're building a dream home.
Yeah. And so I start to realize, okay, I'm going to lose the home. The real estate deals all went sideways. And then for about a 30-day period, I didn't know what I was going to do next. I had been terminated from this company, but I had hopes that they might take me back. And they eventually did. After about 30 days, they did an investigation. They said, hey, we're going to give this guy a second chance. It wasn't really that big of an infraction. He can still work here.
Yeah, I was going to say that's fairly, I don't want to say it was draconian. I mean, that was an ethical breach, but I can see it going like as a warning almost, because you didn't disclose rather than that you knew and facilitated it. But I mean, good on them for having a super tight ethical standard.
They did. And you know what? Good on my leader that he came down on me that way. Because I think what he really saw was a young man who didn't have the right type of character. Like my character wasn't keeping pace with my influence. So at the time, full disclosure, Carey, I thought it was horribly unfair. I mean, I was complaining every day. I was venting. I was, I look back now and I go, maybe he wasn't that bad of a guy. I mean, maybe I would have made the exact same decision, and it worked for my good. So the home office takes me back. They give me my contract. This guy by the name of Tim Bohannon enters my life. He says, hey, you can come work with me, but this is how this is going to work. I want you to build your character, and I want you to put your life back together. And so there's going to be no speaking, no coaching, no teaching, no influencing. You're going to sit in a corner office. I'll give you a staff person, and you're going to rebuild this business. And it was truly a desert season. Like I moved to a new city where I didn't know anyone. I'm rebuilding this business where it's 100% commission. You're making cold calls. I had success and influence. Now I have really none of it. My ego is so bruised and damaged. But I always remind people, I think God does his best work in the desert. He did for me. Like I experienced the Lord in that season in such a real way. I remember going to my closet at night and I would dig into my Bible and I just cry, just weep. And I'd talk to God. And for the first time in a long time, I started to spend time with the Lord, started to lean in with my family. And about 18 months through that desert season, I met this gal named Ashley, and she had 2 kids from a previous marriage. Their names are Audrey and Claire. Today, our 2 oldest of our 4 children are Audrey and Claire. Gotcha. So, God was preparing me to be a husband, to be a father. And I think he knew, like, before I do something with you, I got to do something in you. And there's too much pride and ego for you to lead a family. I'm not saying he caused it, but I think he allowed it. And through that process, I think he prepared me to lead in the home, which is my most important leadership role.
Yeah. So, one of those things, when I was in my 20s, I was in law in downtown Toronto just for a year. And, I didn't have the career to climb because I knew I was leaving, but I watched people and I saw them making boatloads of money and being miserable and kind of realizing, oh, I've seen the top and the top is empty. But you don't really know that until you get there. And I think I easily could have had that story. And even now, with the kind of, audience, et cetera, that we have in what we do now, I think if I had that in my 20s, I don't know whether I would have been able to withstand it. Like, you build up I burned out 17 years ago, blah, blah, blah. That taught me a lot. You've had some corrections in your life. I remember a mentor of mine, Jordan, said to me, God is going to use you, but before he uses you, he's going to break you. And I spent years trying to think like, okay, you have a little fender bender. Is like, is this the breaking? Am I broken now? Or, and then I think the breaking was the burnout that just crushed me. It crushed me. And now I give thanks for it. But that time I thought it was the worst thing ever. But for someone who hasn't had a breaking, what advice would you give them? What warning signs, like if you were advising your 25-year-old self, if that happened when you were 27, you look back now at 25-year-old Jordan, what would you say? Dude, pay attention. Do you not see this? Like what are the warning signs?
I think the warning signs, what I would go back and tell my 25-year-old self, and this is going to sound so elementary and so foundational, Carey. But that old adage about staying connected to the vine? Mm-hmm. I just wasn't, and I know there's some people listening and maybe you're thinking, what does that mean? And if you're not a person of faith, I'll just say this. I think Jesus is the source of hope. I think he's the source of joy. I think he's the source of power. And I just wasn't connected to him. And so if you're living in such a way right now where you feel like you're being pulled from your faith, or maybe you haven't read your Bible in forever, maybe you don't have an active prayer life, or maybe you're listening to this and you're thinking, I don't even know this Jesus character. I just want to encourage you that you might not know Jesus, but he knows you and he wants to have a relationship with you. And the warning sign for me should have been, I wasn't opening my Bible. I didn't have an active prayer life. I wasn't being discipled. I wasn't being mentored. Even if nothing bad is happening, that's a warning.
Yeah.
Especially if you know the Father. Now, if you don't know him, you're thinking, well, I've never done those things before. But if you've done those things before and then you stop doing them, it probably means you're heading in a direction that isn't super healthy. Anything you would add to that, Carey?
Well, no, I want to ask some questions. What was so intoxicating about success?
Oh, I think, you want people to respect what you've accomplished. You want people to I think for me, I wanted the adoration of people. And I think the problem with it is it's addicting in a way. Pride is such a crazy, unique sin because you can't really see it. You can't really identify. John Maxwell said something. This was so helpful to me. He told me this. He said, Jordan, just remember that when people are praising you, they're not really praising you. They're praising the gift inside of you. So for example, when you speak and you're standing on stage and you get the standing ovation from a crowd you barely know, it feels good, doesn't it? And I said, yeah, it does feel good. He said, well, just don't forget, they have no idea who you really are. They don't know you. There's no relationship. They're not admiring you. They can't admire you. They don't even know you. What they're admiring is the gift inside of you. They're admiring the God-given giftedness, the thing that God planted in you that was yours to steward and manage. But remember, God gives and he takes away. I think what's intoxicating, Carey, is I made it about me instead of the gift that God gave me. And I was building my kingdom. And but in its plainest form, it was the adoration and admiration of people.
And to answer your question, I would say for me, it was find out what's driving you. Like there's something under that drive to get bigger, be acknowledged, all that stuff. Like once I was able to put my finger on that, I was able to untangle the threads in a way that really helped. And it's still a, semi-regular check for me. I've got to check my motives even at this stage of my life to make sure that they're pure. What was the easiest part to recover from after you got let go? And then I'm going to ask you, what was the hardest part?
Easiest part to recover from was really simple. It was time with the Lord. Had a pastor friend say, my greatest role, one of my favorite roles in life is being papa to my grandbabies. I love being papa. And he said, one of my favorite things to do is to sit with my grandkids. I love when they crawl up in my lap and they look at me and they call me Papa and they'll just sit with me. And he said, I think God's a bit like that. I think God just wants us to sit with him. He just wants us to crawl up in his lap and say, I'm with you, Papa. I'm with you, Father. And so for me, the easiest thing to recover was my belief in the Lord, my time with the Lord. I think sometimes he has to rid us of certain things too. Like there was so much stuff in my life, so many people and so many activities. There was like this forced slowdown. And so for me, I got back some contentment and some peace. Even though I was broken, there was peace in the brokenness. And it was time with Jesus. I got a lot of that back.
Yeah. What was the hardest part of the recovery?
The not knowing, the unknown. I didn't know how my life was going to continue to move forward. And I remember thinking, okay, God, you took away this professional thing so that you can then put together this other professional thing. I think sometimes we want God to deal with us that way, right? Like you took away this thing in my life, in my profession, and now I need it to be restored in the same way. God didn't do that, at least not right away. What he did do is he reconnected some other veins. He did some heart surgery. And then I think prepared me to be a father and a husband. But I think just the unknown, no idea. I'm in a new city, no idea where my life is going to go. That part of it was really difficult.
What are you using to check your motives today? How has that apparatus changed?
Boy, it's people. A lot of it's people. It's a guy by the name of Dale Mulliken, who's a dear friend and elder at our church, who disciples me. It's some strong accountability from some peers and very close friends that ask intentional questions, the really hard questions. It's my wife and I do marriage coaching on a regular basis.
Where you get coached or you offer it?
Where we get coached. Yeah, we're the ones getting coached.
Got it.
And not because something's wrong. Like I tell people that, like, yeah, we're getting marriage coaching, and people look at us like, well, are you guys good or everything okay? I say, yeah, like actually, it's not perfect, but it's great. Like I think we have a really healthy marriage. We get coaching for every other area of our lives, for our fitness and our finances and our work. We got to get coaching for our marriage because it's sacred. So those are some of the checks and balances. But of course you could always tighten that up. There probably could be more, but those things have been a major help in, keep it on the straight and narrow.
What about the internal checks? Those are all external. Like what is the filter that you use inside of you? Because in many ways you're doing the same thing. You're speaking to people, you're coaching leaders, you've started the Montgomery companies, the whole deal. So it's almost, you're kind of doing the same thing. So I guess the question is, what is
different? Yeah. I really do think it gets back to time with Jesus. It's the close, intimate, personal relationship with the Lord. It's a prayer walk that I do daily. It's time in the Word. I just confessed this, Carey. In my earlier years, I would have said, I believe in the Lord, believe in Jesus, know him. And there's a difference that we all know of knowing him and walking with him. So I knew him, but I wasn't walking with him. I wasn't in his word daily. I didn't really know his word. I didn't understand it. And my prayer life certainly wasn't active. So I think the Holy Spirit has been moving in my life. I think I've experienced his grace in a real way, just spending time with him, But I don't have like a series of questions that I ask per se, or a checklist that I go through. Maybe I should, but I have felt
no, that's fair.
Closer to him, much closer to him in this season.
Great. Tell me about self-awareness and authenticity. They're big leadership topics these days. What are you learning about those two areas? They seem to come up almost everywhere.
I want to give John Maxwell a little plug here. He wrote a new book called The Self-Aware Leader. And John is a friend of yours. And in his book, he says, the first lesson I learned in coaching people is that people have a very difficult time seeing themselves realistically, and a very easy time seeing everyone else. In other words, I can point out everybody else's blind spots, but I struggle to assess my own. And in the same way, I can assess everybody else's gifts, but oftentimes I have difficulty assessing my own. And so what we're learning with a lot of the leaders that we coach with and work with is that even in their wisdom, even in their experience, there's still a lack of awareness only because there's a lack of intentionality. I don't think we become more self-aware on our own. Sometimes we do. We have experiences in life that help us with our awareness. But I think a lot of our awareness is a result of intentional feedback. It's coaching, it's tools, it's systems. And the reality of awareness is it's the beginning of growth and development. I mean, if we're on a journey of leadership development or personal development, I think we have to become aware. If we want to be better in the future, you have to become more aware in the present.
So you coach people on self-awareness?
Yeah, well, we coach a lot of leaders really in the areas of soft skills. And so self-awareness is naturally a part of that. So somebody comes to us and says, hey, I really want to be a better communicator. Okay, well, that's going to start with increased awareness. Or I really want to take more initiative. All right, well, in order to take more initiative, that starts with awareness. I want to be better at asking questions. Well, to be a better question asker, we have to have more awareness. So we do. And we recommend a few exercises. These are all foundational things that most leaders would agree are important, but aren't doing enough of. So one would be just the art of getting more feedback, asking for feedback, craving feedback, just making that a really intentional priority in our lives. This one sounds funny, but we recommend this to all leaders that they record their communication. You and I do this because we podcast and we speak. The average executive leader, or even call it salesperson, hardly ever records their communication. So you think about like an athlete or a musician. An athlete watches the game film. A musician watches the game film. A performer has to watch the game film. The average person in business almost never watches the game film.
What are they looking for when they're watching the playback?
Oh, all kinds of stuff, right? So your posture, your tonality, your eye contact, your pace. I mean, there's a number of things that we sort of grade and look out for. Listeners need to know this. Carey's a champion today, not feeling well, but still braving it and making this a priority. So
forgot to mute on that one, but yeah. Okay. Continue.
All right. I'll tell you a fun story. This is a fun one. So we work with a bunch of coaches and athletes, and this is a top priority is awareness, emotional intelligence, and then specifically tie that to communication. So this coach comes to us and says, hey, I really want to work on my communication. I want to be a more effective communicator. Now, full disclosure, he's already a pretty gifted communicator. He's kind of a energetic guy, he's great charisma and charm, but he says, I want to go to the next level. Okay, great. By the way, it's not that we have all the answers. We just have some systems and processes in place to help people do that. And so he starts sending us communication and, we're giving him some feedback. And then he gives this interview that airs on national television. So a few million people see it. And he wants us to look at it. And this is the early stages of our relationship. So I said, yeah, I'll check that out, take a look at it. It was a 4-minute and 50-second interview. And we graded that. And then we gave him the feedback. And started with the good stuff. Here's the things that went well. But I said, here's the things that we caught or need to change / work on. I said, do you know that you have a tick when you talk? He says, what do you mean? And I said, well, it's something that you do repeatedly. We all have this, by the way. I have one too. There's something that we do or say.
Mine is,
Yeah, right. Mine is right. There it goes. See? So there's something we do that's a little bit distracting. And if we want to be elite in our communication skills, then we have to focus on those things and work on them, because you can't fix what you're unwilling to acknowledge. I said, do you have any idea what your tick is? He says, I really don't. I said, well, you say the words, over and over again. It's like a filler statement, and we did this, and then we did that, and then we won the game, He says, yeah, I guess I do say that. I said, well, I'm just out of curiosity, how many times do you think you said that in this 4-minute, 50-second interview? He says, I don't know. What did I say it? 12 times? I said, Coach, what if I told you said it 111 times in a 4-minute, 50-second interview? And he says, no way, that can't be true. And I said, don't worry, there's only a few million people that saw it. But the reality is, he was saying that, Carey, in every single interview, repeatedly, over and over and over again. So that's an example of a very gifted communicator has a small thing that he's unaware of. And until he watches the game film and has somebody else speak into that, he's not able to fix it because we're unable to fix what we're unwilling to acknowledge. So those are little things that we pay attention to. And, we have some fun with that. But again, I've got a bunch of stuff I need to fix myself.
There are so many communicators, Jordan, who probably would watch that and have no idea it was 111 times. Do you recommend a third party watches it with them? And I'll just be totally transparent. One of the most painful things I do is listen back or watch back to my keynotes or my sermons. And to do that with other people watching is sometimes humiliating.
It is so difficult and yet so important. And I think it's like a lot of things in life, Carey, that are worth doing. They're hard, And so yeah, we recommend you have 3 people give you feedback, and then we give people feedback. So that's 4 sets of eyes and ears that will review the communication. And we want these to be different types of people. In other words, I don't want, if I'm working with a pastor, I don't want the pastor to send that communication to 4 other pastors.
Okay.
Send it to somebody who's younger. Send it to an elder in the church. Send it to an entrepreneur. I mean, in other words, have people listen and review with a different set of eyes and a different set of ears, because they're going to hear it and see it in a different way. So, but that third party piece is critically important.
See, that's really interesting, because I want to test a theory I've had on you, and maybe you totally disagree. I always thought the best advice I've ever gotten in my own communication comes from fellow communicators. So if I go to a restaurant, for example, it's like, how was the pasta? I'm like, it was okay. I can't tell you why it wasn't great. Or if it was great, I can't tell you why it was great, because I can tell you why barbecue was good. I mean, You get me a brisket, I will be able to tell you why it was moist, what was excellent, what was missing, whether it was the round or the flat or the charcoal or the smoke level or the smoke ring. I can tell you barbecue. I can't tell you pasta. My wife, I'll sometimes give her a sauce and she's like, not quite there. This needs honey. I'm like, it doesn't need honey. And then you put honey in it. It tastes like magic. Like, she's so good at that. But it takes a chef to critique a chef. And I always think it takes a communicator to connect to critique a communicator. So sometimes when I've had other people, just random people, they'll tell me, I thought it was good, or it didn't really connect, but they can't tell me why. Do you find that it's other communicators who can tell you why? Or do you think that you can get valuable feedback all the way around? I'm just curious.
Yeah. So we, as the team of people who's reviewing the communication, are a team of communicators.
You're the experts. Okay.
So naturally, they're going to get that. If they're working with us, they're getting the 3 or 4 sets of eyes and ears on that specific piece of communication. I do think from a demographic standpoint, like, this has been a learning for me, Carey. When I speak to a crowd that is baby boomer or Gen X, I have to slow down my communication.
Oh, tell me why.
So I got just great feedback from, an executive leader at a major company, Fortune 100 company. It's a big event. There's 4,000 people in this room. And I spoke fast. I'm a young, energetic communicator. I mean, I go really fast. And at that point in my leadership, a lot of my speaking had been with younger crowds. I would say mostly millennials, Gen Zers. And you know this as well as anyone, communication isn't as much about what you say as it is what people hear. And so if we're going to build trust, if we're going to build rapport, if we're going to speak in a way that lands, then I think it's incumbent upon us to say, who am I speaking to? And what is their style? And how might they want to receive this communication? It's not to say that I'm going to change who I am, change any of my principles, change any of my stories, but I might change something small, like, for example, my pace. We even see this in one-on-one conversations. I'm speaking to you and you have a really calm demeanor. You have this very inviting welcoming demeanor. Okay, earlier today, I was on the phone with my friend Alan Stein. Alan Stein speaks a million miles a minute. He's incredibly energetic. He's a coach. He's a fiery sports guy. Naturally, I might speak to him slightly different than I speak to you. Somebody might hear that and say, well, you're not just being yourself. No, I think that's being in tune with the people you're speaking to. I think that's the art of being an effective communicator. I'd love for you to speak into that. This is good dialogue.
I'm curious about that. I mean, I normally, I'm always amazed. I listen to my podcast at 1.5 speed. And sometimes with my own show, I'll slow it down to 1 and I'm like, man, I'm really slow. But what I find is that if I slow down and I take my time when I'm podcasting, people tell me things they don't tell anybody else. That's why I do it.
Yeah.
It's probably the slowest form of communication I do, and it's long form. So that's my contribution. Any other differences between the generations, Jordan?
I think there's a bunch of them. As it relates to communication and a whole bunch of other factors. As it relates to communication, here's what I'd say for leaders listening, and by the way, go check out Tim Elmore, who's I think a mutual friend of ours. Jason Dorsey's another one who's a generational expert. So go check those guys out. But here's what I think is a major difference when it comes to communication. The Gen Zers, so 29 years and younger right now, grew up in a world of instant communication.
Yep.
Direct messages, text messages. I didn't grow up in quite that world. I'm 35 years old, so I identify as a millennial. I got my first cell phone as a sophomore in high school. So I didn't quite grow up that way. But then a Gen Xer definitely did not grow up that way. So a Gen Xer is going to come to that person and connect with them on a Monday morning, maybe, and hey, I communicated with you. And then think it's okay to check back in the following Monday if this person is a direct report.
Right.
And to that Gen Zer, that Gen Xer is dead.
Yeah,
they're like totally dead to them. They're like, I think they left. I don't even know where they're at. I don't even know that they exist anymore. And then the Gen Xers thinking, but wait a minute. I just talked to you last Monday. What's the big deal? So there's some major differences. And one of them is frequency of communication. So if we're leading younger people, we have to have far more touch points, shorter meetings. Attention span is way shorter. Shorter meetings, more touch points. I think that's a major one in dealing with younger people specifically.
It's interesting. I know you're a listener to this podcast. This episode isn't out, but Erwin McManus will be by the time this airs, talked about fast learning with Gen Z, that he has to change his communication style. I think he might be a younger boomer. I'm not sure. Could be Gen X, but he's basically saying, yeah, I got to change my communication style because they learn so quickly. I can move on faster. Really good point. Yeah. And Tim Elmore was on this show talking about all the generational differences. But when it comes to communication, what else are you noticing? So slower cadence with Gen X and boomers, more frequent communication with younger leaders. What else do you see as communication tricks between the generations?
I would say questions and brevity.
Say more about each.
Yeah, I think maybe a Gen Xer is okay with longer form communication.
Yeah.
And a Gen Zer wants you to get to the point. Again, move quick. I got it. Let's move on.
In this video, sorry. Yeah. In this video, I will boom 47 seconds later. You're done.
Yes. And I'll just say this way, Carey, having listened to thousands of pieces of communication, as part of what we do for a living, is review communication. Mostly from salespeople and people who orate publicly. But I don't know that I've ever told someone to speak longer, like go longer. And conversely, hundreds of times, in fact, probably a majority of the time, it's you have to be more concise. You have to go shorter. You have to get to the point. You have to say it in fewer words. So I think brevity is key. And then questions, the power of a question. Dale Carnegie said a person's favorite sound is their own name. Their favorite topic is themselves. Leadership has far more to do with asking the right questions than it does giving the right answers. And I think people who ask really great questions are some of the best communicators on the planet. And by the way, you are one of those people. You're a phenomenal communicator and you're a phenomenal question asker. And you have this way of keeping the attention and focus on other people. And it's part of what makes you so great at what you do. So you can just receive that. That's true of Carey.
Well, thank you. You know, it's interesting. We took a quick break because of my cough attack and this cold that won't go away. And you said, no, it's okay. We can edit that stuff out. And I said, yeah, but if I'm always on the verge of coughing, I can't focus on what you're saying. And if I can't focus on what you're saying, I'm not going to do a good job in the interview. I'm not going to do my part because it doesn't really matter what the question is that I sent you yesterday or the day before. What really matters is what's happening in the moment, my ability to track with it. Like all this stuff about generational differences in public speaking wasn't in the script. There's no script, but it wasn't in the questions that I sent you ahead of time, but it was really interesting to me. And so I want to hopefully not cough much more and focus in on that, but I appreciate that. Can you teach a Gen Xer or baby boomer new tricks? Can you change, can the leopard change its spots? Can we learn to get shorter, faster, more interesting? Or do you think that Gen Z and younger millennials are just kind of going, yeah, I don't want to listen to boomer and Gen X preachers anymore? Like, what do you make of that? Or communicators?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, of course we can. Of course we can. I think it takes greater intentionality.
Sure.
I have to believe that about the people we work with, or I couldn't say yes to working with them. So I have to start with this basic premise that this person can change. This person can morph. We can teach them new things. I do think it starts with an open mind. And again, a whole lot of awareness. So if we're going to move them down a path, my favorite person is a person with an open mind. And John Wooden has that famous quote, it's what you learn after you know it all that counts.
Yeah.
And I just love that. And Carey, you're one of those people, you have an open mind in light of all of your success, in light of all that you've learned. You have this beautiful way of taking in new things and asking more questions and staying curious. And some of that's the paradox of education, right? The more you learn, the more you realize you don't know.
Yeah, I spent 11 years in university and basically learned nothing. Well, that's not true, but you realize what you don't know, right? Yeah.
So yeah, exactly. That's right. So to answer your question, yes, I think people can change. I think, there needs to be more conversation and greater intentionality. And I think the experts, I think the Tim Elmores and the Jason Dorseys would support that.
So let's talk about short form versus long form. I agree the average book should be shorter, not longer. I read a lot of books for this job. I read a lot of books just for life. Will Guidara's Unreasonable Hospitality, who was my other interview today, that was one of the few books in the last 5 years that I was like, oh, that could have been longer. Very, very rare that I run into that. David McCullough's history books, sometimes I wish were longer. His book on the Wright brothers, Doris Kearns Goodwin, her book of Team of Rivals, I wish was longer. But that's very few. Most books could be shorter. I think most sermons could be shorter. And yet, long form has a place. I mean, if you look at HBO and the number of documentaries, miniseries, series that are going on, there are leaders who are saying, okay, I've learned how to do the 47-second reel. I've figured out how to do shorts. I figured out how to do vertical video. Where does my longer content go for the next generation? How would you answer that?
That's a really great question. And I think I would answer it this way, not that I have all of the answers. I think if you are engaging with somebody in a deeper way, so for me, in my context, it would fit into like a workshop or a full day training. I mean, there's far more time allotted. I think here's where we struggle. This is where I struggle. And this is where people struggle. When we violate the expectation of time, it changes the way that people receive communication.
Okay, say more about that. I want to hear about this. What is the expectation of time?
So if I have a workshop, I've got a group of people who are coming ready to receive and expect long form communication. Now, it might happen in a nuanced way over the course of a day, kind of some back and forth and some different exercises, but they are prepared for a long form communication type of scenario. If conversely, there is a TED Talk scenario, there are a series of speakers at an event, and the speaker chooses to violate the audience's expectation, the talk could actually be an A+. But if the talk was supposed to be 20 minutes and it just went 40 and it's cutting into lunch and people are hungry and they're there really to network and hang out with each other, the audience, the perception is actually that the talk is a lesser talk because the person communicated, violated their expectation of time.
Is this gut or do you have data? Because
I do not have data. I wish I did. I wish I had this big research.
I agree with you 100%. Andy Stanley years ago said we should set time expectations for church services. So he would typically say, and I did this for years too, you'll be here for about an hour or an hour and 5 minutes. When I go to a play, like, on Broadway or downtown Toronto or something, I want to know, when am I going to be out of here? I want to know. And if it's like short, like if it goes a minute longer, I get upset, I get irritated. Speakers who go too long drive me crazy, although I have been guilty of said crime. And I mean, at one of the conferences I host in Atlanta, Rethink Leadership, we put the speaker's clock on public display. So it's a form of shaming. If the guest goes too long, if we give you 18 minutes, the whole audience knows if you went too long. Like we shame you into staying on track. What is underneath that? I agree with you. So sorry, that's a little bit of my pet peeve.
Yeah, that's
but
so
tell me
good.
more.
That's so good. So here's what I think it is. For me anyway, I think I have to remember as a communicator, I am not at the center of my audience's world. I am not.
Yes.
And I think a lot of times as communicators, we think that we are. Well, they came to my event. Well, they came to my church. They came to my thing. They're at my speaking engagement. Well, okay, but that person also has a significant other or a spouse that they're trying to get home to.
Or a kid who's got a fever.
A kid who has a fever, an issue or a fire they're trying to put out at work, an email inbox that's starting to fill up, text messages that are coming in on their phone, a lingering health issue that they're concerned and worried about. So your audience is dealing with all of this other stuff that is competing for time and attention. And if we start to factor all that in, then I think we have a propensity to say, I need to give this person back some time because I'm not at the center of their universe and they have other things that they want to do. I think when we start to go long and violate expectation, we think maybe too highly of ourselves or assume that we are at the center of their universe, and we simply are not.
Have you had any success coaching communicators to go shorter? Because generally what I find is that most people who go too long think, well, other people have to go shorter, but I can justify it. Any thoughts on that?
All right, this is going to sound cynical.
That's okay.
I believe this to be true, that each one of us overestimates how good we are
Here.
at the art of communication.
Yep.
Myself included.
Yep.
Because we communicate how we want to communicate, right? I mean, that we're so used to us and the rest of the world doesn't necessarily communicate like us. And so I think I overvalue and I overestimate. And when I overvalue and overestimate something, I'm likely to take advantage of it. And me going long is a form of overestimating, overvaluing, and taking advantage of somebody else's time.
So how do you self-discipline to make sure that you come at or under the time allotted when you speak publicly?
Well, part of this is a little bit of experience, I suppose, Carey, and you can relate to this as somebody who's been speaking for years and years. Over time, I think you develop a bit of an internal clock.
Oh, it's still a battle for me, man.
But it is still a battle.
I can go long every time.
It is still a battle. This is how I've kind of worked through it over the years. When I prepare to speak, whether it's a workshop, a keynote speech, speaking to a team, a church, I almost always have rehearsed that and I've timed it. And if I'm over, I immediately start to subtract and think through, okay, how can I reduce? And how can I be a bit more concise? I had a mentor, he said, I'm going to give you one, it is a great orator, somebody I really respected. I said, I'm going to give you one piece of advice as you enter into this space of public speaking. This is when I was kind of getting my start. He said, here's the one rule. Do not go long. And I've just never forgotten that. And so that stuck with me in my preparation that if that's something I need to really look out for, then I have to time and be really conscientious of timing in my preparation.
That's good. Who's more forgiving, corporate audiences or church audiences? As for speakers, like who's the more forgiving audience?
Yeah. Woof. Well, you'd be able to speak to this in a as a pastor better than me. I have to imagine, I've said this to many pastors, that it's more difficult. Now, I've never been a pastor, full disclosure.
Yeah.
It is far more difficult to speak as a pastor than it is to speak as an orator at corporate events for a number of reasons. Number one is I can say the same thing repeatedly to a bunch of different audiences.
Fair.
Nobody knows. If you're pastoring a church, your congregation is getting you over and over and over again. So they've heard your quip, they've heard your joke, they've heard your story, they've heard your, like, here goes Carey again, right? And even though you're a really gifted communicator, people get used to you. So I think it's
one of the reasons I don't communicate regularly is after 25 years, I'm like, I think I've cycled through a lot of my ideas, a lot of my angles, a lot of my stories. And I'd prefer to be the guest at this point who comes in once or twice a year and delivers something fresh and then moves on. And yeah, I don't know. I mean, Rick Warren did it for 40 years at Saddleback and others have done it for a long, long time. But I just found now leadership, I got an endless tank. I have a theory for you because I've done corporate events. I spoke at South by Southwest, which was not a Christian audience, and other places. I find that pastors often have a communication skill level that corporate leaders don't. The average CEO, CFO, CTO, CMO is not naturally a good communicator unless they've gotten coaching. So you have an inherent advantage. On the other hand, you can't be undisciplined because a business audience really demands data, points, takeaways, value, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. So, and in one way, a church audience is easier, I think, than a business audience because you have a built-in advantage being a decent communicator, probably because you have so many reps as a preacher, but the standard is much higher.
I would agree with all of what you just mentioned.
Oh, do you? Okay. Feel free to disagree.
I do agree with that. I would say to that end, though, back to which audience is most forgiving, I had to learn this when I first started speaking in the church. And today I'll speak in the church maybe a dozen times a year, just to different groups or, I'm not speaking a Sunday sermon, right? But I might go speak to a men's group or a youth group from time to time. And when I first started speaking in the church, I had a mentor tell me, you need to remember that when you're speaking in the church, or you're speaking from God's word, you're coming under a different authority.
Yes. Yeah,
and 100%. That requires a different posture. And that was an adjustment for me because again, in the corporate space, I can be big energy, out front, excited to be here. How you doing? That doesn't work in church world. And so there's a humility, I believe, required in the church world. And you're coming under a different authority. And I think if you're going to teach from God's word, there's just a completely different posture. That was a major adjustment for me.
Do you think, this is a loaded question, so it's not even really a question, but do you think that if you bring that posture of humility into the business space, that is a very well-received posture?
It totally is. And it's even more powerful. So I'll just tell you how typically when I speak, I'm sharing the story of, not always, it depends on the audience and the specific keynote that I'm giving, but oftentimes I do share my story of, redemption and destruction and, this major fall from grace. And we speak often about the power of vulnerability and authenticity. And you wouldn't believe how many people have said to me at the end of a keynote, Carey, I get this time and time and time and time again. Somebody will say, well, I kind of liked you, or I kind of didn't like you. Like I wasn't really sure of you until you shared that story at the end.
Yeah.
And you shared that story, and that resonated with me. I connected with that. And the reason it connects and the reason that it resonates is every person has been through hard stuff. Maybe not the type of brokenness that I've been through, or, everybody's different, but they can connect with that. Craig says it this way: people can be impressed with your strengths. They connect with you through your weakness.
Yeah.
And we have to make a choice. Okay, are we going to be impressive, or are we going to be impactful?
Would you ever lead with that story?
I thought about that, and I have a few times if it's shorter form communication, and maybe I need to. I'll accept that.
I usually lead with something that doesn't paint me in a flattering light.
Yeah, there's maybe some real power to that.
Immediate bond. They need to know you're competent, that you're not an idiot, right? Like, oh, this guy, and let the bio or the introduction do that. But then when you come up and just share out of your humanity, I think Brene Brown changed the game on that years ago.
Totally did. I love Brene's message and content.
I love talking about communication. Okay. Well, you're also a podcaster, and you've got some really fairly big name Christian guests on your podcast. I would love to know, because I get this question all the time, what your guest strategy is for getting guests for your podcast.
Well, get some really good friends, like the Carey Nieuwhofs and the David Nurses and the Brad Lomeniks. And, we've been so blessed, Carey, just to have friends.
It was Lomenik that connected us.
Lomenik connected us. Yeah. Brad is like a secret weapon in so many ways. He's the most abundant, caring, generous person, constantly connecting. So we've been really blessed to just get connected. But I would also say this, that we've worked really hard at connecting. Like I'm already thinking, literally in my subconscious as we're having this conversation, Carey, I'm thinking about people that I need to connect you with for a variety of reasons. And so, I believe that connected people are connecting people, and connecting people are connected people. So if you want to have certain guests on your podcast, one of the things I've learned is just be a master connector. Like, be generous, be giving, connect people with intentionality, but it doesn't have to be for a specific reason. In other words, I could say, Carey, you ought to connect with this person. Maybe you'll do a podcast. Maybe you'll collaborate on an event. I have no idea. What I do know is you share the same spirit. You're immensely talented. You're both really well connected, and you just need to spend some time together. And that has worked really well. So if you're asking for my strategy,
I am, because there's a lot of young leaders listening. Like, I know Lomenik knows a million people, but he doesn't always connect everybody. So how did that connection happen?
So here's what I'd say. Okay, let's get practical. If you're a young leader listening and you would like to have more great guests on your podcast, here's what I would do. I would figure out who are the people that you really want to get, and then how do you serve those people, or how do you serve the people that they care about? Mark Cole said this on our podcast about John Maxwell. I was asking him about his run with John over the last 25 years. Mark Cole is the CEO of Maxwell Leadership. So I'll give Mark credit. This is beautiful. He said, if you really want to grow in your influence, find out what the leader's agenda is and make it your agenda for a season. I would add to that, find out what the leader's issue is and make it your issue for a season. So I'll just tell you, full disclosure, there's some leaders we're working with. John Gordon is one of them. And John knows. I said, John, I want to learn from you, want to grow with you. I'm going to make John's agenda my agenda for a season. I respect John. I want to learn from John. Brad Lomenick is another one. I'm going to make Brad's agenda my agenda. Patrick Lencioni is another one. And I've been very upfront with those guys. I'm going to make your agenda my agenda for a season. Now, if I say that, then I really have to serve. It can't be, I'm serving so that I get this in return. It just means the causes, the things that are going on in their world, I got to get behind them. I got to care about them, and I got to participate. I have to be an active participant in those things. And I've just learned, I'll give you an example. This is a blessing that's come out of service. John and I have done some events together. So John calls and says,
This
hey,
is
I'm doing this
John
event.
Maxwell?
John Gordon. Sorry.
John Gordon.
John Gordon. I'll tell you two examples of this. John Gordon reaches out, says, hey, I'm doing this event with Pat Lencioni. Would you like to host, produce, and MC? I said, sure. Again, happens through service. There's now another event planned with Ed Milet and another event planned, I think, with Erwin. And again, I'll play the same role in those events. That does not happen if there hasn't been value added to John, if I haven't gotten behind some of the things that John cares about. But I think because of that, I think John said, I appreciate Jordan's intentions, and I know that he's attempting to add value. And so those things will come back around to you. But I've also been burnt by that. I've also had leaders where, gosh, I've served and served and served, and that doesn't come back around, and that's fine. Another example, we're taking 20 leaders to Orlando, Florida next month to hang out with John Maxwell, Sean McDermott for 24 hours. So John wants to kind of pour into the next generation of leaders. I've tried to do some things with Maxwell Leadership to get behind some of the things that they care about. And now it's like God's opening doors really wide to spend more time with John and his team. And it doesn't even make sense. The point is this: add value, serve, connect, be way more generous than you think you should. And you will wake up in a world where you've got a great network with a bunch of friends and a lot of genuine relationships. I have found that so many people want to take instead of give. And so they'll drop into people's DMs, hey, would you be on my podcast? And it's not that doesn't work. The probability of you developing a really meaningful relationship, if that's your style, I think is pretty low. So I'd ask yourself the question, do you want a podcast guest or do you want a relationship? I want both. I want a podcast guest, but I want a relationship. I want to know, how do I serve Carey Nieuwhof? How can I add value to Carey? How can I connect Carey? How can I get behind some of the things that Carey cares about and add some gas to that fire? Because that's where your influence really starts to expand and grow.
That's really great advice. And sometimes I think that happens one-on-one. And sometimes I think people now want to be known for being known. But we mentioned him a few times on this show, Craig Groeschel, back on my podcast. And one of the things he said, and he's told me this, but he said it publicly now, is he discovered me not because somebody introduced us, but because I started writing, blogging 10 years ago. And every time he Googled something, he found me. And then eventually he's like, how come this guy keeps showing up? And then eventually we had mutual friends who connected us, and, now we have a friendship. But that was adding value while having no idea who was reading or whether anybody was reading or any of that stuff. So I just love your answer to that. And I think even if you don't have those kinds of direct relationships, just really add value to the people who are following you, and don't worry about the fact that somebody who, you have nobody who has a New York Times bestselling book following you at this time. Because you never know. If you add enough value to some people, eventually, it comes around. I don't know what that is, but I really appreciate your advice on that.
It totally does. And I would say this too, because there's somebody listening thinking, well, I don't have a podcast. I don't have the influence yet. I don't have the resources. There are little things like find out who is got a book coming out. Maybe there's some authors that you respect. Find out if they're putting out a book, reach out to them, and don't say, hey, would you be on my podcast? Would you like to talk about your new book? Say, hey, I would love to help you promote and distribute your new book. And I'll do whatever you want me to do. I will make phone calls. I'll send emails. I'll put stuff on social media. I'll have you on, if you do have a podcast, I'll have you on my podcast. Heck, I'll buy a bunch of books and give them to my friends. Is there anything I could help with in getting your book out into the world? And they may or may not have an answer for you, but they might say, actually, I'm doing this event. If you'd like to volunteer at this event and come hang out and hand out books, that'd be great. Well, okay, now you just found a way to add value. You put yourself in close proximity to the leader, and you have a chance to develop the relationship. So a lot of this stuff isn't rocket science, but it starts with a heart to care and adding value to others.
That's so good. Hey, anything else you want to share, Jordan, before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I'll just say this to you, Carey. love to encourage you before we sign off. I respect you so much, and I've really enjoyed following you and your work. And I would say there's two things that I want to encourage you in. And there's two things that I think you model really, really well for the world around you and for the people listening. One is authenticity. I think you have managed to remain authentic as you influence others. You wear your faith on your sleeve. I think you have a really authentic style. I think when people connect with Carey, they feel like they're getting the real Carey. I think what you see is what you get. And I think you've worked hard to stay true to who you are. And
thank you.
In a world that can be so fake and artificial, I think authenticity wins now more than ever before. And so that's your humility. It's your vulnerability. It's your willingness to admit fault and mistakes. And I've heard you talk about burnout in your story. And so all of that is just so incredibly attractive. The other thing I would say, though, that really I think you're world-class at is asking questions. I think you are curious. I think you're a lifelong learner. I think you know how to make it about others and make somebody feel really special. My wife said this to me yesterday. She said, Carey might have had the most prepared approach to a podcast that we've seen a lot. And the questions weren't like scripted leadership questions. Like the questions were detailed questions about my life. And there's no way you come up with this list of 13 or 14 questions that are detailed about my life if you and your team hadn't really done your research and your homework. And if you didn't have a really sincere, genuine curiosity in having this conversation. So just want to encourage you in that. I think you modeled those two things really well.
I really appreciate that. And today you even got the hacking attack cough version of Carey. So that's about as authentic as it gets. Jordan, I love to see the difference between 35 and 27 in your life. I love to see the influence God has given you, and you gave young leaders and older leaders some incredible advice, and made me think about communication in fresh ways. And there were some really delightful surprises in the interview today. So thank you so much for being on. Hey, people are going to want to follow you online. Where's the easiest place to do that these days?
Yeah, pretty active on social media. So Instagram, Jordan M. Montgomery. Pretty active on Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter. Send us a message if we can add value or be helpful.
Yeah, mostly social.
Send a message on social. And then our website is montgomerycompanies.com. So companies is plural. montgomerycompanies.com. And again, if we can add value, be of service, reach out, let us know.
Jordan, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Carey. You're a blessing. Be well.